7 days after her daughter's car disappeared down the driveway for the last time, Margaret Hale stood in her kitchen at 6 in the morning and watched a bowl of tuna sit completely untouched for the third day in a row. The cat hadn't moved from beneath the dining room table in almost 72 hours. Not to eat, not to use the litter box properly. Not even to lift her head when Margaret said her name. "Olive," Margaret whispered, kneeling on the cold tile in her bathrobe. "Honey, you have to eat something." The cat's amber eyes opened halfway, looked at Margaret with something that could only be described as grief, and closed again. Margaret sat back on her heels right there on the kitchen floor and felt her own chest crack open because she recognized that look. She recognized it because she'd seen it in her own bathroom mirror every single morning since her daughter Rachel had loaded the last box into a moving truck bound for Seattle, 3,000 miles away, and left her cat behind because the new apartment didn't allow pets over 10 pounds. The refrigerator hummed in the silence behind her. Outside, a school bus rumbled past on the street, the same street it had rumbled down every weekday morning for 30 years, and Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually looked out the window to watch it go by. She stayed on that kitchen floor a long time, long enough for her knees to ache against the tile, long enough for the coffee maker to finish its cycle and click off, unattended, in the next room, the smell of burnt coffee eventually reaching her where she knelt. So let me ask you something, right here at the start, before this story goes any further. Have you ever watched an animal grieve something and realized, with a jolt that stopped you cold, that you were watching your own heartbreak reflected back at you in fur and silence? Because that's exactly what happened to Margaret Hale on a gray Tuesday morning in her empty kitchen, and it changed everything that came after. Margaret was 63 years old, and up until 3 months earlier, her house had been full of noise, full of laughter, full of a daughter who'd moved back home 2 years prior after a rough divorce, bringing with her a scruffy orange tabby cat named Olive and a whole lot of healing that needed doing. Margaret's husband, Walter, had passed away 5 years before that, quietly in his sleep, the kind of ending that leaves you grateful and gutted in the same breath, and after he was gone, the house had felt like a museum nobody visited. She'd kept his reading glasses on the nightstand for almost a year before she could bring herself to put them in a drawer, and even then she hadn't been able to give them away, just moved them one drawer deeper. She still, to this day, kept his old flannel jacket on the hook by the back door, and some mornings, walking past it in the half-dark, she'd let her fingers brush the sleeve just to feel the fabric still there. When Rachel moved back in with Olive tucked under one arm and a suitcase in the other hand, Margaret hadn't realized how much she'd needed the sound of another living thing padding through her hallways until it was there again. Those 2 years had been some of the best of Margaret's life, if she was honest about it. She and Rachel had fallen into an easy rhythm, coffee together every morning at the kitchen table, Rachel working from her laptop while Margaret puttered in the garden out back. Olive stretched out in whatever patch of sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor throughout the day, following the light from room to room like a small orange compass. Olive had been Rachel's cat originally, rescued from a shelter the year before the divorce, a scrappy little thing with a torn left ear and a habit of headbutting anyone who sat still long enough to be headbutted. But somewhere in those 2 years of shared mornings and shared grief, Olive had become something that belonged to the whole house. She slept at the foot of Margaret's bed as often as Rachel's. She waited by the front door every afternoon for whichever one of them came home first, tail flicking with anticipation at the sound of tires in the driveway. She was, in every way that mattered, family, and Margaret had stopped thinking of her as Rachel's cat somewhere around the 6-month mark, though she never said that thought out loud to anyone. Then Rachel got the job offer. A good one, the kind you don't turn down, at a design firm in Seattle that had been trying to recruit her for over a year. Margaret had told her daughter to take it, had meant every word of encouragement she'd offered over that final dinner together. Roast chicken and mashed potatoes, Rachel's favorite since she was a girl, because a mother does not stand in the way of her child's future no matter how much the thought of an empty house again made her stomach drop. What she hadn't expected, what neither of them had really planned for, was Olive. The new apartment building had a strict weight limit on cats, and Olive, at 14 pounds of solid orange muscle, simply didn't qualify. Rachel had cried for 2 days trying to find a workaround, a different building, a pet deposit exception, a letter from the vet, anything, before finally, tearfully, asking her mother if Olive could stay, just until she got settled, just until she figured something out. Margaret remembers Rachel sitting on the edge of the bed that night, suitcase half-packed beside her, saying, "It's only temporary, Mom." "I promise. A few months, maybe." Margaret said yes without hesitation. What she didn't fully understand until the moving truck pulled away, until she stood in the driveway waving at a rear bumper that got smaller and smaller until it turned the corner and was simply gone, was that she wasn't just keeping a cat. She was keeping the last living piece of a house that used to be full, and that cat was about to break in half right along with her. The first few days after Rachel left, Olive searched. That's the only word Margaret could find for it. She went from room to room, checking under beds, behind doors, inside closets, the same 3 or 4 spots over and over, as if Rachel might be hiding somewhere in a game that had gone on too long. She sat by the front door for hours at a stretch, ears perked at every car engine on the street, springing up each time only to sink back down when the sound faded past without stopping. She'd press her nose against the gap under the door, sniffing at the cold draft, then look up at Margaret with an expression that seemed to ask a question Margaret had no way of answering. One evening, Margaret found her sitting inside the closet in Rachel's old room, surrounded by a few boxes that hadn't made the moving truck, and something about the sight of that small orange shape curled among the last remnants of her daughter's belongings made Margaret close the door softly and walk away without a word, unable to watch any longer. Margaret watched this happen for 4 straight days before she understood what she was really witnessing. Not confusion, but mourning, playing out in real time in front of her, in a language that didn't need words to be perfectly clear. By the 5th day, Olive stopped searching. That was somehow worse. She retreated under the dining room table, the darkest, most enclosed spot in the house, wedged behind the center leg where the shadows pooled thickest, and she simply stayed there. She stopped grooming herself, her once glossy orange coat growing dull and matted along one side. She stopped chirping the little greeting sound she used to make every time Margaret walked into a room, a sound Margaret hadn't realized she'd grown so attached to hearing until it disappeared entirely. She barely lifted her head when Margaret called her name, and when she did look up, her eyes had gone flat in a way that made Margaret's hands shake the first time she really saw it up close, kneeling on the floor with a flashlight to check if the cat was even breathing steadily. Margaret tried everything she could think of in those first 2 weeks. She bought a new brand of wet food, the expensive kind in the little foil packets that Olive used to go wild for, tearing the foil back with her teeth in a rush of excitement. She left it by the table leg, and it sat there for hours, congealing, the smell growing faintly unpleasant, until Margaret finally threw it away and tried again the next mealtime, and the one after that. She tried the laser pointer that used to send Olive skidding across the hardwood floors in gleeful chaos, crashing into furniture legs, utterly undignified and utterly joyful. Olive watched the red dot dance across the carpet with dull, disinterested eyes and didn't move a muscle. She tried sitting on the floor beside the table herself, talking softly, the way she used to talk to Rachel when Rachel was small and couldn't sleep, humming half-remembered lullabies under her breath. Olive would let her get close, would sometimes even allow a hand on her head, but there was no purr underneath it, no warmth pushing back. Just a body that used to be a cat, going through the motions of surviving, and a woman on the floor beside her going through the motions of the exact same thing. Margaret called the vet on the 10th day, her voice tight with a worry that had nothing rational to hold on to, and everything emotional, driving it forward. Dr. Ferris, a kind woman who'd been treating Margaret's pets for almost 20 years, listened to the whole story over the phone, the searching, the retreating, the untouched food, and didn't dismiss any of it. "Cats grieve," Dr. Ferris said simply. "People don't always believe that, but they do. Attachment loss is real for them, especially a cat who's bonded that closely to a person for that long. I'd like to see her today if you can bring her in." Margaret drove Olive to the clinic in a carrier the cat hadn't been inside in over a year, and Olive didn't fight it, didn't yowl the way she usually did on the rare trips to the vet in years past. She just sat there, small and still, staring out through the metal grate at nothing in particular, and Margaret found the silence somehow more alarming than any amount of yowling would have been. The exam came back clear on everything physical. No infection, no illness, no injury. Dr. Ferris ran her hands gently along Olive's ribs, which were beginning to show more than they should, feeling for the muscle mass that should have been there, and finding it thinner than it had been at the last checkup, and looked at Margaret with the kind of directness that Margaret would come to be grateful for later, even though in that moment it landed like a stone in her stomach. "This is feline depression," Dr. Ferris said. "It's real, and left untreated, it can absolutely become life-threatening. Cats can develop hepatic lipidosis if they stop eating for too long. Their liver can start to fail trying to metabolize their own fat stores. We need to turn this around, and soon, not next month." She wrote out a plan on a small notepad, the kind of plan that sounded almost embarrassingly simple, written down in blue ink: a strict routine, consistent feeding times, controlled access to sunlight, short structured play sessions even if Olive showed no interest at first, and, above everything else, patience. "She needs predictability, Dr. Sentius," Ferris said, tearing the sheet from the pad and pressing it into Margaret's hand. "Grief thrives in chaos. Give her something steady to hold on to, and don't be surprised if it takes weeks before you see any real change." Margaret drove home from that appointment with a folder full of printed instructions on her passenger seat and a hollow feeling she couldn't quite name pressing against her ribs. It wasn't until she pulled into her own driveway, into a garage that used to have 2 cars in it and now had 1, that the feeling finally found its shape. She sat there with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled, and she thought about how she hadn't showered before 9 in the morning in over a week, how she'd stopped opening the curtains in the living room because the empty street outside felt like a taunt, a reminder of every car that wasn't Rachel's pulling into the driveway. How she'd been eating cereal standing over the sink for dinner 3 nights running, because cooking for one person in a kitchen built for gathering felt unbearable, felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. Dr. Cocker. Ferris's instructions weren't just sitting on the passenger seat for Olive. Margaret realized, with her hands still gripping the wheel and her throat closing up tight, that she needed every single item on that list every bit as much as the cat did. That realization should have been the turning point. It should have been the moment everything started to lift. But grief doesn't hand you a clean slope upward just because you've named the problem, and the weeks that followed tested Margaret in ways she hadn't braced herself for. She started small, the way the folder instructed. Same feeding time every morning, 7 o'clock sharp, and the same feeding time every evening, 6 o'clock, no exceptions, no variation, even on the mornings when getting out of bed at all felt like the hardest thing she'd ever attempted. She opened the blinds in the living room again, even on mornings when the gray Ohio sky outside made the effort feel pointless, because Dr. Torsa, Ferris had underlined the word sunlight twice on that notepad, and Margaret had decided to trust the underlining even when she didn't trust much else about her own judgment lately. She dragged an old cat tree out of the garage, one Rachel had bought years earlier that Olive had barely used, brushing off a layer of dust and cobwebs, and set it up in the exact spot where the afternoon light hit the living room floor the longest. For 3 straight days, Olive ignored it entirely, staying curled beneath the dining room table in her self-made cave of shadow, and Margaret began to wonder, in her lowest private moments, if maybe some things just couldn't be fixed by routine alone. The food remained the hardest battle. Olive would sniff at the bowl, sometimes lick at the edge of it half-heartedly, and then turn and walk away, her tail low, her steps careful and slow like an old woman navigating ice. Margaret started sitting on the floor next to the bowl at every mealtime, not touching Olive, not coaxing her, just being present the way Dr. Fall. Ferris had suggested, because apparently even that mattered to a grieving animal, proof that someone was still there, still showing up, even when nothing was being asked of them in return. Margaret would sit cross-legged on that kitchen floor in her robe, watching a bowl of food go cold, feeling every bit as pathetic and every bit as necessary as she imagined. Olive must feel curled beneath that table. Some mornings her back ached so badly from the sitting that she had to hold onto the counter to pull herself back up, and she'd stand there a moment, palm pressed flat against the cool laminate, wondering how 2 living things in one small house could feel so completely alone together. Her neighbor Ruth, who'd lived 2 doors down for over 20 years, stopped by one afternoon during that stretch to drop off tomatoes from her garden and found Margaret sitting on the kitchen floor mid-vigil. Instead of asking questions, Ruth simply sat down on the floor beside her, uninvited, in her gardening clothes, and the 2 of them sat there together in silence for almost 20 minutes watching an untouched bowl of food. Before she left, Ruth squeezed Margaret's hand and said, "Grief doesn't care what species it's wearing, honey. You just keep doing what you're doing." Margaret thought about that sentence for days afterward, turning it over the way you'd turn over a smooth stone in your pocket, and she found herself repeating it silently on the harder mornings, like a small private prayer. There was a night, near the end of that 2nd week, when Margaret woke at 3 in the morning to complete silence, no fan noise, no hum from the hallway heater, nothing, and in a rush of pure animal panic she threw off the covers and ran downstairs in her bare feet to check that Olive was still breathing. She found her exactly where she'd left her, curled tight beneath the table, ribs rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm, and Margaret sank down onto the cold floor right there in her nightgown, and simply sat with her hand resting near, not on, the cat's small body until the sky outside began to lighten gray at the edges. She never told Rachel about that night. Some fears, she decided, a mother keeps to herself. 2.5 weeks in, on a Thursday evening that Margaret would replay in her memory for years afterward, Olive ate 4 bites of food before walking away. 4 bites. Margaret sat on that kitchen floor and cried harder over 4 bites of cat food than she had cried at her own husband's funeral, because those 4 bites felt like the very first crack of light through a door that had been sealed shut for weeks. She texted Rachel that night, something she'd been doing sparingly, not wanting to burden her daughter 3,000 miles away with worry she couldn't do anything about, and simply wrote, "She ate a little today." Rachel called within the minute, crying on the other end of the line, guilt and relief tangled together in her voice, asking over and over if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving Olive behind, if this was somehow all her fault for chasing a job 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. Margaret told her the truth that night, the whole truth, something she hadn't planned on saying out loud to anyone yet. She told Rachel that Olive wasn't the only one who'd stopped eating properly. She told her about the cereal over the sink, about the unopened curtains, about the way the house had gone so quiet in the mornings that Margaret sometimes talked to herself just to hear a human voice in the rooms, narrating the weather report out loud to nobody just to fill the silence. Rachel went silent on the other end for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Mom, I didn't just leave her with you. I think maybe I left her so she could take care of you, and neither one of us realized it." Margaret didn't have an answer for that. She just held the phone a little tighter and let the silence sit between them, comfortable for the first time in weeks, two women 3,000 miles apart, breathing on the same line. The following month became the hardest stretch of the whole ordeal, harder in some ways than the initial grief itself, because progress with something this fragile never moves in a straight line. Some days Olive would eat a full portion and rub against Margaret's ankles the way she used to, purring faintly, and Margaret would feel a surge of hope so strong it nearly buckled her knees right there in the kitchen. Then the next morning, Olive would be back under the table, untouched food in the bowl, ears flat, eyes dull, as if the previous day's progress had never happened at all, as if Margaret had imagined the whole thing out of sheer desperate wanting. Margaret learned, the hard way, that healing an animal's broken heart wasn't a staircase. It was a tide, coming in and pulling back out, and the only thing to do was keep standing on the shore no matter which direction the water happened to be moving that day. She wrote the good days down in a little spiral notebook she kept on the counter, not because Dr. Ferris told her to, but because on the bad days she needed proof, in her own handwriting, that the good days had actually happened. There was one particular night, about 5 weeks after Rachel left, that Margaret would never forget for as long as she lived. She woke up at nearly 2 in the morning to a sound she hadn't heard in over a month, a soft thump on the mattress, followed by the familiar weight settling near her feet, cautious at first, testing the space. She lay perfectly still in the dark, afraid that any movement might send Olive fleeing back to her hiding spot, and she listened. A low rumble started somewhere in that small orange body, hesitant at first, stuttering, almost rusty, like an engine that hadn't turned over in weeks and wasn't sure it remembered how. It was a purr. The first purr Margaret had heard from that cat in over a month, and she lay there in the darkness with tears running sideways into her pillow, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loud, just listening to the sound of something broken, slowly, painfully, remembering how to be whole. The digital clock on the nightstand read 1052 when it started. She watched the numbers change 3 separate times before she finally let herself drift back to sleep, afraid that closing her eyes too soon might make the sound stop. She didn't tell anyone about that night for days. It felt too fragile to speak of out loud, too much like it might shatter if she handed it to someone else too soon. But she started noticing other small things after that. Olive began sitting in the sunlit spot by the cat tree for a few minutes at a stretch, not playing, just sitting, letting the warmth fall across her fur, eyes half closed in something that almost resembled contentment. She started following Margaret from room to room again, not clinging exactly, but present, the way a shadow is present, close enough to be felt without needing to be acknowledged. The vet check 3 weeks later showed weight gain, not much, just under a pound, but Dr. Ferris looked at the chart and then at Margaret and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. This is exactly the direction we want." It's slow, but slow and steady is a real thing worth trusting. What Margaret hadn't fully realized, in all those weeks of forcing herself onto that kitchen floor at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening, was that she had built herself a routine, without ever meaning to build one for herself at all. She was opening those curtains every single day now, not because a vet's notepad told her to, but because she'd started to genuinely want to see the light come into the room, wanted to watch the way it moved across the hardwood the same way Olive used to chase it. She was cooking real meals again, not because Olive needed her to model good habits, but because the smell of something simmering on the stove had started to feel like comfort, instead of a chore too heavy to lift, had started to remind her of Sunday dinners with Walter, memories that used to hurt too much to touch, and now, slowly, felt more like warmth than wound. She caught herself, one Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, laughing out loud at something on the television. An actual laugh, unguarded and surprised out of her, and she sat there afterward in stunned silence, trying to remember the last time that had happened in this house. Her friend Carol from church, who'd been leaving well-meaning casseroles on the porch for weeks without ever quite managing to get Margaret to open the door for more than a minute at a time, finally got invited in for coffee during that stretch, and she sat at the kitchen table watching Olive weave figure eights between the table legs, tail held high, and said, "Well, would you look at that? Somebody's feeling more like herself." Margaret hadn't been sure at first whether Carol meant the cat or meant her, and then she realized it didn't matter, because the answer was both. That same week, Margaret found herself signing up for a small Thursday morning grief support group at the church, something she'd avoided for 5 years since Walter passed, telling herself she'd only go once to see what it was like. She sat in a circle of folding chairs in the fellowship hall, listening to other widows and widowers talk about their own versions of an empty house, and when it came her turn to speak, she surprised herself by talking not about Walter at all, but about a cat who'd stopped eating and taught her how to start again. Several women in that circle nodded like they understood completely, and one of them, a widow named Joan, said afterward in the parking lot, "Sounds to me like that cat gave you permission to grieve out loud." Margaret drove home that morning feeling lighter than she had in longer than she could remember, and she went back to that circle every single Thursday after that. The breakthrough, the real one, the one that felt less like a single crack of light and more like a door swinging fully open, came on an ordinary Saturday morning almost 2 months after Rachel had driven away. Margaret was in the kitchen making coffee, humming along quietly to the radio, when something orange streaked past her ankles at full speed, chasing a crumpled ball of paper across the hardwood floor with the kind of reckless, joyful abandon Margaret hadn't seen from that cat in what felt like a lifetime. Olive skidded into the base of the cabinets, claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth floor, batted the paper ball under the refrigerator, and then sat up on her haunches, staring at the gap where it had disappeared with an expression so purely, ridiculously indignant that Margaret burst out laughing until her sides ached. She had to sit down right there on a kitchen chair, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her robe, while Olive continued to stare at the refrigerator gap with the deep personal offense of a creature who could not fathom why the universe had betrayed her this way. That was the morning Margaret truly understood what had happened over those 2 long months. She hadn't just nursed a grieving cat back to health. Somewhere in that daily discipline of feeding times and sunlight and sitting on cold kitchen floors, she had built herself a lifeline without ever intending to, a series of small anchors that had kept her tethered to living even while every part of her wanted to sink beneath the surface of an empty house. Olive's healing and Margaret's healing had never been 2 separate stories happening side by side. They had been the exact same story the entire time, wearing 2 different faces, one covered in orange fur and one lined with 63 years of loss that had finally found somewhere safe to land. The emotional weight of it hit Margaret hardest on a phone call with Rachel a week later, when her daughter asked, almost offhandedly, how things had really been. Margaret found herself telling the whole truth for the first time without softening a single edge of it, about the 72 hours of untouched food, about sitting on the kitchen floor feeling every bit as hopeless as the cat curled beneath the table, about the 2 in the morning purr that had cracked her wide open, about laughing until she cried over a paper ball lost beneath a refrigerator. Rachel was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said, her voice thick, "I think I sent her home to save you, Mom, and I don't even think I knew I was doing it." Margaret looked over at Olive, who had claimed the warmest patch of afternoon sun on the living room floor and was stretched out in it with total, unbothered contentment, and Margaret said softly, "She saved us both, honey. I really think she did." By the time full autumn arrived, Olive was, by every measure the vet used, completely recovered. A healthy weight, a glossy coat, a purr that started up the instant Margaret walked into her. Dr. Ferris ran her hands along those same ribs at the next checkup and found muscle instead of bone, told Margaret with a genuine smile that she rarely saw the reversal happen this completely, that some cats never fully came back from a grief that deep. But the deeper change was harder to put on a chart. Olive had started sleeping curled directly against Margaret's side every single night, instead of at the foot of the bed the way she used to with Rachel, as if some new understanding had settled between them, some unspoken agreement about who belonged to whom now. She greeted Margaret at the door every afternoon with the same eager chirp she used to save only for Rachel. She'd taken to sitting in Margaret's lap for long stretches in the evenings, something she'd rarely done in her younger years, purring so steadily and so deeply that Margaret sometimes joked she could feel it in her own chest, like a second heartbeat keeping her company. Margaret kept every single item from that folder Dr. Ferris had handed her, tucked now into a kitchen drawer, not because she needed the instructions anymore, but because she couldn't bring herself to throw away the piece of paper that had quietly saved her life alongside her cat's. She still opens the curtains every morning without fail. She still cooks real dinners, sometimes for herself, sometimes with Carol from church, now that she's found the strength to reach back out to people she'd let go quiet on for months, sharing a bottle of wine over the kitchen table on a Friday evening, the way she used to before Walter died and then forgot how to do again. She still sits on that kitchen floor sometimes in the mornings, coffee in hand, just to watch Olive eat, because some habits stop being about survival and simply become about gratitude, about bearing witness to how far something can travel back from the edge. There's a particular moment Margaret returns to often, one late afternoon in that first September after Rachel left, when she found Olive curled directly in her lap on the porch swing outside, both of them soaking up the last warm light of the day before autumn turned everything cold. The chains of the swing creaked their familiar rhythm, the same swing Walter had hung from the porch beam 30 years earlier, and a breeze moved through the maple tree at the edge of the yard, sending down the first few red leaves of the season. Olive wasn't doing anything remarkable. She was just there, a warm, steady weight against Margaret's stomach, purring low and even, utterly unbothered by the world. And Margaret sat there rocking that old swing slowly back and forth, tears sliding quietly down her face, not from sadness this time, but from something far more complicated and far more beautiful. The particular ache of watching something you love come all the way back from somewhere dark and realizing you'd made that same journey right alongside it without ever quite noticing you'd started walking. Rachel visited for the first time that Thanksgiving, flying in from Seattle with a bag full of gifts and a nervousness in her eyes that Margaret recognized instantly, the fear of walking back into a house she'd left broken and finding it still broken. Instead, she walked through the front door to find her mother laughing in the kitchen, real color in her cheeks, the smell of roasting turkey filling the whole house, and Olive bounding across the hardwood floor to greet her with an enthusiasm that had nothing haunted left in it at all. Rachel dropped her bags right there in the entryway and sat down on the floor with her old cat, and Olive climbed straight into her lap, the way she used to, purring immediately, no hesitation, no lingering wound. Rachel buried her face in that familiar orange fur and cried, relief pouring out of her after months of guilt she hadn't fully admitted to carrying. But when Rachel looked up at her mother standing in the kitchen doorway, both of them saw the truth in that room without either one needing to say it out loud. Olive was glad to see Rachel. But it was Margaret's name she came running to now. It was Margaret's lap she'd choose every single evening for the rest of her life. Somewhere in those long, quiet, difficult months of grief and slow healing, that cat hadn't just recovered. She had chosen a new person to belong to, and in doing so, she had given a lonely, grieving mother a reason to belong to someone too. Over that Thanksgiving weekend, sitting together at the table that had once felt too big and too quiet for one person, Margaret told Rachel about the little spiral notebook still sitting on the kitchen counter, the one filled with small handwritten notes from those hardest weeks. She ate 4 bites today. She purred at 1:52 this morning. She sat in the sun for 6 whole minutes. Rachel flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers tracing her mother's handwriting, and said it was the most honest diary of grief and healing she'd ever read, even though not one single entry mentioned the word grief at all. Margaret told her she planned to keep writing in it, not because Olive needed watching anymore, but because she'd discovered she liked keeping track of small good things, a habit worth holding on to long after the crisis that started it had passed. Before Rachel flew back to Seattle that Sunday, she hugged her mother tightly at the airport gate and said, "Take care of her." Margaret smiled and said, "She's the one taking care of me, sweetheart." Always has been. Winter came gently that year, the way it sometimes does in Ohio when everyone braces for the worst and gets something softer instead. Margaret strung the same lights around the porch railing that she and Walter used to hang together every December, and this time she didn't cry doing it alone, because Olive sat in the window the whole while, watching her work, chirping occasionally at the string of lights swaying in the cold air. On the first snow of the season, Margaret opened the back door just to feel the cold on her face, and Olive padded out onto the porch behind her, sniffing at a single snowflake that landed on the railing, and then retreated quickly back inside with an expression of pure feline betrayal that made Margaret laugh out loud into the quiet morning. It was, she realized later, the kind of small, ordinary moment she wouldn't have had the strength to notice, let alone enjoy, 4 months earlier. She wrote it down in the spiral notebook that same afternoon, right beneath an entry from the week before. "Now I want to ask you 2 things before you go, because a story like this one is only half told until we hear your side of it. Have you ever watched an animal grieve so deeply that it forced you to finally face your own grief you'd been avoiding? And what small, ordinary routine ended up saving you during your hardest season, the thing that felt too simple to matter until you realized it was the only thing holding you together?" Type your answer in the comments below, right now, because somebody scrolling through today needs to read exactly what you have to say. If stories like this one, stories about the quiet, healing, life-saving bond between broken people and the animals who refuse to give up on them, mean something to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a brand new story just like this one, a story that will find its way straight into your heart when you least expect it and need it most. Like this video if it moved you even a little. Leave a comment and tell us about your own Olive. And tonight, when you get home, take a moment to really look at whatever animal is waiting for you there, because sometimes the ones we think we're rescuing turn out to be the ones quietly rescuing us right back.